Hi, welcome to week 1 of English 101, and this week we're going to talk about literary elements that are specific to fiction writing. We're also going to start to learn a little bit on how to use academic research to write a paper. These are both really important topics that you're going to use throughout this course and throughout a lot of classes in college. So, let's get started. Okay, if you're watching this video because you're in one of my classes, you'll be using this book here, Backpack Literature by Pearson. This is the 4th edition. If you're watching this video because you're interested in learning about literary elements, listen up, you just won't have the book to reference. So, this book has a lot of chapters, and your assignment for this week is to kind of skim and go through the first 8 chapters. That sounds like a lot of work, and it is, but the first 8 chapters cover a lot of the things that are really useful for fiction writing. So, let me kind of explain. Chapter 1 in the book talks about how to read a story, very important. 2 talks about point of view, which is one of those literary elements that the author's point of view is incredibly important. Chapter 3 is on character. Chapter 4, setting. Chapter 5, tone and style. Chapter 6, theme. Chapter 7, symbolism. And Chapter 8 has sample stories. Chapter 9 starts poetry, which we'll talk about in the next video. So, let me kind of do a brief rundown on what these literary elements are, explain it a bit for you, so you have a reference before you start reading. Point of view is the perspective that a story is being told from. Now, what we're really comfortable with in stories is usually third person omniscient and third person limited point of view. Now, these are terms we don't normally think of. What it means is third person is it is a character usually outside the story, some sort of all-knowing narrator who just knows things and is telling the story, probably in the past tense. That's useful because then there's someone who can know all the details and can relate it to you, the reader, or to your reader if you're writing it. Omniscient meaning they know everything. Third person limited meaning maybe they focus on just one character's thoughts. Now, you do have some examples, really famous examples, fairly recent, that break this common type of narrating. And that is, say, the Hunger Games novels. In the Hunger Games, it's told first person by a character in the story itself. Now, that does happen in fiction, but it's first person, present tense is really, really tricky because you have Katniss Everdeen, and she's telling the story because you're inside her head and you know what she's thinking. So, like when she gets stung by tracker jackers and she's tripping out, that affects her narration, and it's crazy. In your textbook here, one example that's similar to that is the story, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. The narrator is kind of crazy, or is being driven crazy by the guilt he feels after having killed someone and buried them in the floor, and he thinks that he's hearing the beating heart. And it's driving him crazy to the point that someone who's crazy telling a story can't necessarily be trusted, right? Because they're not lucid. What they're saying might not be logical, but it makes for an interesting story. So, something to think about when you either read or write a story is how can an element like that help or hurt the story? You don't want to do something crazy just because you can. It needs to have a really good reason. Let me give you a couple of old movie examples. And by old, I mean the 90s. Okay, in the 90s, there was a famous movie called The Matrix. And in The Matrix, it does something really different, right? There's a lot of crazy special effects, which, wouldn't be as fancy if it didn't really, really fit the story, right? The idea for the Matrix is actually taken from a really, really boring book called Simulation and Simulacrum by Jean Baudrillard. It's a philosophy book, and so you get these terms that show up in the movie like the desert of the real, and it's actually really heavy, complicated theory about what's real and what's not real, which they turned into an interesting story element. And because it works, it works. If it was just like, now we're going to talk about what's real and what's not real, wouldn't make for an interesting story, but they turned it into something cool with guns and special effects, and it was very successful. Around that same time period, there's another movie called Memento, which was the first big movie that guy Christopher Nolan started, the guy who went off to make the Batman movies more recently, like Interstellar, and this summer Dunkirk is coming out that he did. The story is told out of order because the main character, his perspective, is affected because he has short-term memory loss. And so what he does is he tattoos details on his body and puts post-it notes all over his hotel room where he's staying at, so that after he sleeps and he forgets everything that's happened that day, he can still remember. Well, it creates an interesting story that's basically told backwards, as he works backwards to try to figure out what happened to lead to his memory loss. So the story is told backwards, but there's a good reason, because of his memory loss. That is a literary element at its finest, really showing what you can do through perspective. Chapter 3 in the book talks about character. Character has a huge impact on a story in ways that it's really even hard to limit. Stories just aren't interesting if you don't care about the characters. It doesn't mean you have to like the characters, but you have to care about them in some way. Let me give you a bad example, because I only give bad examples. In the TV show Dexter, Dexter is a bad dude, right? He works in a morgue, and he gets, he doesn't like people getting away with murder, and so he decides he becomes a serial killer, and he goes gets justice. Not recommending this, by the way. So he does bad things, right? But that's not what makes the show interesting, because it's told in a way that you start to care about the character. And so even though you may not agree with what he's doing, you have a reason to care about him. Does that make sense? There's a lot of TV shows that do this, to where the characters might make bad decisions, but you still stay with them because you've been given a reason to like them. This is really, really common in so many different types of storytelling, especially lately, as Hollywood is trying to really change the cookie cutter happy ending stories that we are so used to. So character is really important. Usually, whoever the main character is, we care about them, right? Unless they're just boring and lame and we don't like that. Whatever. So it's important. You, as someone who's writing about these things, you need to be able to form an opinion and say something valuable. Now, let's talk about the benefit and the reason to write about literature in the first place. You are not trying to write the only possible paper on the topic. Because with any fiction or poetry paper, there's no limit to the different perspectives that can be presented on that paper, right? Because anyone who reads it might look at it a little bit differently. The value of writing about literature is to point out things that might be valuable. So there's a huge focus on perspective. The further you get into college, we probably call this literary theory, but for this level, let's just use the term perspective. So you might focus on something you want to talk about, like point of view, or character, or setting, and talk about how these things affect the story in a significant way. It could be good, it could be bad, but whatever point you make, you want to explain why it's significant to pay attention to that. And you want to give examples and you want to back it up. And when possible, you want to bring in outside sources to talk about it as well. So let's look at the course supplement, which is part of the web course, as an example. Okay, so as you look at the course supplement, you're going to see that there's different chapters. Chapter 1 lines up with this video here, how to write a literary analysis paper on a short story, which is your goal for the week. So there we go. Okay, so there's a brief introduction that kind of covers some of the things I've already talked about, and it leads into your activity number 3 for the week, which is an online forum for you to talk about what you've read and kind of mull over some ideas with your classmates. So as with any discussion forum, you've got to be nice, you got to be respectful. It's okay to disagree with someone, but keep it classy, right? Okay, so here are a couple topics to keep you focused. You could talk about the literary elements, questions like, what is the difference between plot and theme? Or you could focus on something specific to literary analysis, like asking questions like, what is literary analysis? How do you read scholarly articles? Things like that. Because that's ultimately what we're learning in this week to help us with subsequent weeks. So if you have access to the EAC library, I recommend that you go inside, you check it out. If you are completely distant, maybe you're not in Thatcher to get to the library, you still have access to the online databases for the library. And this is really important in this course because you need to become familiar using the online resources for the library. So here's some links. Go to the EAC website, eac.edu/academics/library. That'll get you there. You can use your Gila Hank login so that you can access all the databases, search for articles, things like that. Okay, so the next thing that you'll see in the course supplement is I put a sample paper that I wrote when I was working on my master's degree. And it's called Bodies as Language in J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians. This is a paper I presented at a conference. And so it does exactly the kind of thing we're trying to do in this course. It uses a perspective to talk about an interpretation for a novel, and then it backs it up and it gives examples. It's not important that you've read the actual document, but I give you some examples here, and it uses MLA, cites some sources there. So once you've read through the course supplement, you've watched this video, and you've discussed, you've done the reading for the week, you skimmed through chapters 1 through 8 in your textbook, and you've talked to your classmates, you will have had several different ways to learn about literary analysis, and it'll get you ready to write your big assignment for the week, which is right here, Activity 4. Use what you've learned from your reading assignments and from your participation in the classroom discussion to write a 1,000-word literary analysis on one of the short stories from backpack literature. That meets each of the following requirements. So you don't just pick and choose what you want to do. You have to do all of these things. 1, you have to write about one or more of the literary elements discussed in chapters 1 through 8 of the textbook. You have to include a clear and well thought out thesis on your paper topic. So you have to have something to say and it has to be clear. You need to find one or more scholarly articles using the library's website to support your thesis statement. And because you're talking about a source, you need to use direct quotes, paraphrases, summaries from your textbook, and at least your one scholarly article. Of course, everything that we do is in MLA, and you have to upload it as a Word document. So let me talk about this in a little more detail. Okay. So, one more time. Your assignment, you pick a fiction story out of the first 8 chapters of the book. You choose something you want to focus on, or more, of those literary elements like plot, theme, something like that. And you're going to have to go to the EAC library website to find a source to back you up. Now, if it's a really famous story, there's probably a lot of sources on it. But what you're learning this week is how to use a source to support your interpretation of something that you're reading. That's incredibly important. So let's talk about how to do this. So, how do you write a paper, a literary analysis paper? Well, again, the whole thing is about perspective. In English 101, you learned how to present a thesis, that you had to look at different evidence and present it as your own in a way that supports your perspective. Learning that, now all you're doing, you're bringing in a literary text, a short story that you're going to use, what you learn in 101, to write about a short story. So let's say I want to do Dead Man's Path by Chinua Achebe. I'm going to read it. I'm going to develop a perspective that I want to talk about. Maybe I want to talk about setting, because it takes place in Africa. And so I'm going to focus on that. I'm going to go into the EAC database online. I'm going to search for Chinua Achebe and see if I can find someone who talks about Dead Man's Path. Now, Chinua Achebe has written a lot of other things which have gotten a lot of attention. Maybe all the sources won't help with this one, but you want to find something that is relevant to your topic. And then you write a paper that's going to cite frequently from this so that you can discuss the story from the perspective that you are presenting. Now, you still want to use everything that you already know. You want to have a clear thesis. You want to use evidence. You should write an outline to make sure everything's organized. And you want to use your source material frequently. What that's going to teach you are the basics for what you need for the research paper that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Now, this video assumes that you already understand several key concepts. One, you know how to use a source. Two, you know how to use MLA. All we're doing is we're taking and we're focusing on literary elements in a paper. So you need to form an opinion that you're going to present on one of these things, and write a good paper. And you don't want to do less than 1,000 words, because that is the minimum. So that's it. If you have questions, ask it in the forum and web study. If these resources don't quite get everything that you need to get the job done, you can check out other videos on this channel. It talks about outlining, how to write essay, even how to do MLA. It's a great resource. So you might want to subscribe or simply check out the other videos on the channel. And of course, if you have questions, you can ask me. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.